On July 22, 2026, the National Center for Meteorology issued a severe warning for Riyadh. The capital city was stepping directly into a dangerous zone of 49 to 50 degrees Celsius. The ambient air, out on the streets, begins to warp the horizon into a shimmering mirage. But the most terrifying number of the summer is not found on any weather forecast or glowing street thermometer. It is hidden deep inside the roaring turbines of domestic power plants. According to data tracking the energy sector, Saudi Arabia burned approximately 647,000 barrels of crude oil every single day in May of that year, just to meet domestic demand. Think about the absolute scale of that consumption. A massive portion of the very wealth this kingdom normally extracts to sell to the global market is being entirely intercepted. It is being held back from the export ports and diverted into massive combustion chambers. That crude oil is turned into electricity. That electricity is instantly converted into cold air. And that artificial cold air is pumped furiously into concrete boxes so that human beings can simply continue to exist inside them. This is no longer just a severe heat wave. This is the 50-degree oil trap. 50 degrees is no longer just a piece of weather information. It has become a permanent structural tax levied directly on the kingdom's primary export asset. Why would a global energy superpower be forced to incinerate its own most valuable resource just to keep the temperature of its living rooms at a tolerable level? We are going to look closely at a mechanical loop that is consuming the wealth of the desert. We need to start by looking at what extreme heat actually does to the concept of time. Follow the steps of a typical construction worker building the future skyline of Riyadh on a Tuesday morning. At 11:45, the construction site is a symphony of grinding metal and heavy machinery. By 11:55, the workers are frantically hydrating and securing their heavy equipment. At exactly 12 o'clock, the entire site falls completely silent. From June 15th to September 15th, every single year, the government strictly enforces a direct ban on all outdoor labor under the sun between noon and 3 in the afternoon. You must understand that a government does not simply erase 3 entire hours from the economic workday unless those 3 hours have become a lethal hazard. The heat physically alters the properties of exposed steelmaking tools impossible to hold. The sun transforms the open pavement into a burning surface that can bake the soles of boots. This is not about comfort or taking a midday rest. Extreme heat does not just take away physical comfort from the population. It literally takes away the hours that human beings are permitted to operate under the open sky. When the sun reaches its zenith, the workforce is commanded to retreat into the shadows. The outdoor economy is temporarily suspended, but the energy pressure generated by those people does not simply vanish into thin air. When humans retreat from the sun, the entire burden of their survival is transferred instantly to the electrical grid. In a place with a temperate and gentle climate, an air conditioner is considered a modern convenience. It is an appliance you turn on to make a humid afternoon slightly more pleasant. But in Riyadh or Dhahran, on a day approaching 50 degrees, that exact same white plastic box behaves much more like a localized life support system. Imagine the sequence of events during a power failure. If you turn off the lights in a room, it simply becomes dark. If you turn off the air conditioning for long enough, that same room begins to accumulate thermal energy, like a giant car, locked directly under the glaring summer sun. The concrete walls slowly radiate the heat they have absorbed. The ambient air becomes thick and suffocating. In 2025, the Saudi Electricity Company reported that their peak power load reached an astonishing 77.1 gigawatts. That is an enormous volume of electrical current surging through transmission lines. That surge is not driven by heavy industrial manufacturing alone. It is driven by millions upon millions of compressor units fighting desperately against the atmosphere. The Saudi electrical grid does not just sell power to consumers. During the grueling summer months, it provides an artificial habitat required for human survival. Try to visualize your own city, completely unable to tolerate even 2 hours of a blackout at midday without risking mass medical emergencies. When a simple power outage becomes a direct threat to public health, you realize that cooling is no longer a luxury appliance. It is the absolute foundational layer of modern civil infrastructure. We need to break down exactly how this mechanical trap functions. The formula is completely relentless and mathematically predictable. As the outdoor temperature pushes higher, the millions of air conditioners must work longer and pull harder to maintain the temperature delta. This immediately spikes the electrical load on the national grid. To prevent the grid from collapsing, the domestic power plants demand an immediate influx of fuel. Saudi Arabia relies heavily on natural gas for its power generation, but when the load spikes beyond the capacity of the gas infrastructure, the grid operators must turn to crude oil and heavy fuel oil. This is where the economic paradox is born. Every single barrel of oil that is ignited inside a domestic boiler is a barrel that can never be loaded onto a tanker ship. It can never be sold to a refinery in Europe or Asia. The King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center has extensively documented this intricate relationship between warming climates and surging electricity demand in their detailed research reports. Imagine a wildly successful bakery that has to burn its own most expensive cakes just to keep the bakery refrigerators running. The bakery has plenty of inventory in the back room, but every premium cake thrown into the furnace is a direct loss of potential revenue. Oil does not just create wealth for the kingdom anymore. A significant portion of it is now being permanently drafted into service as the fuel that protects Saudi society from its own sky. Let us look at the financial weight of this daily transaction. The numbers accelerate at a frightening pace during the hottest months. In the summer of 2025, the amount of crude oil burned directly averaged roughly 593,500 barrels per day. By May of 2026, that figure had climbed to nearly 647,000 barrels every single day. Analysts, projecting the data for the peak summer of 2026, estimated that the total consumption of crude and fuel oil for power generation could exceed 1 million barrels daily. While some of this fluctuation is tied to regional geopolitical disruptions and gas availability, the fundamental driver remains the brutal thermal load. Close to 600,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. These barrels are not sitting inside massive tanker ships crossing the ocean. They are not generating foreign capital to fund massive futuristic city projects. They are converted into electricity. The electricity is converted into cold air, and the cold air is pumped into a room just so a family can sit comfortably in the afternoon. This is the strangest economic cycle on the planet right now. The kingdom digs its greatest asset out of the deep earth, only to immediately set it on fire to fight off the heat of the sky. Saudi Arabia is incredibly wealthy, and it absolutely has the financial capacity to pay this daily cost. But having the ability to pay a massive expense does not make the expense disappear. It simply means the kingdom can afford to keep the trap running longer than anyone else. The real trap is not that Saudi Arabia is going to run out of oil tomorrow. The trap is that the nation is structurally forced to consume larger and larger quantities of the very thing that generates its geopolitical power. But the air conditioning compressor is only 1/2 of the summer bill. When you look at the energy demands of a desert metropolis, you have to look beyond the thermostat. A city in the Arabian Peninsula needs massive amounts of electricity so its residents do not bake in the heat, but it also requires an equally massive amount of electricity so its residents do not die of thirst. Extreme heat naturally causes human beings and agricultural systems to require significantly more water. But there are no endless freshwater rivers flowing through the sands of Riyadh. The water must be manufactured. Saudi Arabia operates some of the largest and most complex desalination plants on the face of the earth. These facilities pull millions of gallons of corrosive seawater from the coast and force it through high-pressure membranes or boil it to extract the salt. Producing fresh water from the ocean is an incredibly energy-intensive industrial process. The International Energy Agency forecasts that cooling and desalination combined will account for nearly 40% of the growth in electricity demand across the Middle East and North Africa by 2035. In the exact same moment that millions of air conditioners are dragging the power grid to its absolute limit, the massive water pumps are also demanding their share of the electrical current. The national power grid does not just keep the city cool, it keeps the city from dying of thirst. Faced with this dual threat, you might assume that Saudi Arabia has an obvious and perfect solution. They have the most abundant source of energy shining down on them every single day. But the desert does not give away its solutions for free. Solar power appears to be the perfect escape route from the 50-degree oil trap. The sun is the very thing causing the problem, so it makes perfect logical sense to harvest its energy to power the cooling systems. It sounds like a flawless closed loop of renewable survival. Saudi Arabia is indeed investing heavily in massive solar farms spreading across the open terrain, but the desert environment actively fights back against this technology. The problem is not the sunlight, the problem is the sand. A thin, continuous layer of atmospheric dust constantly settles over the surface of the photovoltaic glass panels. According to research from the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, this dust accumulation severely degrades the efficiency of the solar technology. Their models estimated that in a hypothetical scenario with weekly cleaning panels, could still lose roughly 15% of their output on the western coast and up to 45% on the eastern coast. This forces the kingdom to deploy vast fleets of cleaning robots and human crews working through the night to wash the glass. In June of 2026, researchers had to announce the testing of new protective coatings just to help the panels maintain efficiency while reducing the amount of precious water needed to wash them. The desert environment does not necessarily destroy the solar solution in a single catastrophic day. Instead, it slowly erodes the daily power output. It demands constant maintenance and operational funding. The trap does not crush the nation with a sudden collapse. It drains the system through thousands of small, continuous maintenance costs. The desert simply ensures that every single technological solution becomes increasingly expensive to keep alive. At this point, any critical observer must raise a very serious counterargument. You could argue that Saudi Arabia is more than equipped to handle this. This is a sovereign state, with immense financial reserves and unbelievable engineering capabilities. They have the money to import the best technology the world has to offer. Their power grid has successfully sustained the country through periods of extreme peak load without suffering catastrophic nationwide blackouts. They are aggressively expanding their natural gas networks to take the pressure off crude oil. The Public Investment Fund purchased a 30% stake in Saudi Tabreed, a company that manages roughly 779,000 tons of district cooling across major cities. They are building centralized, highly efficient cooling networks rather than just relying on individual window units. Furthermore, on July 22, 2026, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed a framework for civil nuclear cooperation. This opens the door for stable, zero-emission baseline nuclear power. So perhaps this is not a fatal trap at all. Perhaps this is just a complex engineering equation and Saudi Arabia simply has enough money to buy the correct answer. But if you look closely, that exact defense reveals the most alarming truth of all. A sovereign nation does not build hundreds of thousands of tons of centralized cooling capacity just for comfort. It does not construct the most massive desalination infrastructure on Earth just as an experiment. It does not lay out endless oceans of solar panels and push for a complex nuclear program just to solve a minor inconvenience. The kingdom is building all of these monumental systems because the very habitability of its cities depends on every single one of them operating perfectly, without interruption. The immense scale of the technological solutions proves the absolute immense scale of their vulnerability. Saudi Arabia can absolutely win every single individual engineering battle it fights. But every time it implements a new solution, it creates a completely new mechanical system that must be funded, protected, and maintained in that same brutal heat. Vast wealth gives Saudi Arabia the weapons to fight back against the trap. But that wealth does not make the trap disappear. It merely upgrades the complexity of the survival systems. Eventually, we have to move the conversation away from power grids and pipelines. We have to talk about the absolute biological limits of the human body. You can insulate a modern skyscraper. You can pump thousands of tons of cooling capacity into a luxury shopping mall. You can engineer a futuristic airport that stays perfectly chilled. But Saudi Arabia cannot put a concrete roof over its entire landmass. You cannot air condition every single construction site, every single open highway, and every single human being all at the same time. The tragic events of the Hajj pilgrimage in 2024 exposed this biological limit to the entire world. Temperatures along the sacred route soared past 47 degrees and officially exceeded 51.8 degrees at the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Saudi authorities confirmed that 1,301 people lost their lives during the pilgrimage. The vast majority of those who perished were unregistered pilgrims who lacked official access to the network of air-conditioned buses and cooling tents. They were forced to walk for hours under a punishing sun without the protective shield of modern infrastructure. Technology can successfully cool an enclosed space, but human beings eventually have to walk outside to travel between those cooled spaces. This also strikes directly at the heart of the kingdom's ambitious vision. 2030 goals to become a massive hub for international tourism. You cannot invite millions of global tourists to explore ancient ruins and coastal resorts if the outdoor environment is biologically hazardous for a third of the year. The ultimate limit of this trap is not found in the depth of the oil reserves. It is found in the cellular breakdown of the human body when exposed to extreme thermal stress. Are these futuristic cities actually adapting to the changing climate? Or are they just building an endless series of heavily fortified rooms so that people can hide from the climate? This brings us to the final form of daily life inside the 50-degree trap. Look at the choreography of a modern resident navigating the summer. They wake up in an air-conditioned bedroom. They walk into an air-conditioned garage to start an air-conditioned car. They drive to an air-conditioned underground parking structure. They take an elevator up to an air-conditioned office tower. Later, they might visit an air-conditioned shopping mall. They spend their entire existence moving desperately from one bubble of cold air to the next bubble of cold air. Between these bubbles lies a dangerously hot void. The outside world becomes a hostile vacuum, where the pavement can literally cook whatever is left on it for too long. The only thing standing between these two worlds is an automatic sliding glass door, and behind that glass door is an entire national energy infrastructure that is absolutely forbidden from ever failing. Those who have wealth enjoy seamless transportation between the cold bubbles. Those who labor in the streets must absorb the direct impact of the sky. Saudi Arabia is no longer just cooling its buildings. The nation is actively industrializing the very concept of human habitability. Saudi Arabia was built upon an incredible geographic advantage that very few nations in history have ever possessed. They sit upon a massive ocean of high-quality energy buried just beneath the sand. But the rising extreme temperatures are completely rewriting the meaning of that natural advantage. Oil can no longer just be a tool to generate foreign revenue. It must be burned to create domestic electricity. Electricity can no longer just power economic growth and digital infrastructure. It must be directed toward generating cold air and fresh water. That cold air does not just provide a relaxing atmosphere for the residents. It literally manufactures the physical zones where humans can continue to operate and survive. Saudi Arabia is not going to run out of oil tomorrow. Their national power grid is not on the verge of a sudden nationwide collapse. And their vast capital will allow their engineers to continue adapting for a very long time. But every single summer that ticks hotter sends a massive new invoice directly to the kingdom. It is an invoice that must be paid in burned fuel, deployed capital, massive infrastructure projects, and ultimately, the physical endurance of the human body. That is the reality of the 50-degree trap. It is not the sudden cinematic moment where Saudi Arabia runs out of energy. It is the quiet, creeping reality that more and more of the nation's energy must be sacrificed purely to ensure that Saudi Arabia remains a place where human beings can live. A true global energy superpower does not wake up afraid of running out of fuel tomorrow. It wakes up afraid that it will have to burn its own wealth every single summer just to survive under the sun. This documentary is based on currently available data regarding climate impact, energy consumption, and infrastructure challenges in Saudi Arabia. Projections about future energy demands and temperatures are based on statistical models from recognized meteorological and energy institutions. The narrative focuses on structural, economic, and environmental challenges and does not predict the imminent collapse of any national systems. If this deep dive into the hidden costs of extreme heat changed the way you look at global energy, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments below how your own city would handle a week of 50-degree weather. We have more investigations into the intersection of climate and economics coming soon, so turn on notifications and we will see you in the next video.